Hello, this is Dr. K. Welcome to this week's module on HTTP, servlets, and JSP. This lecture is based on Chapter 1 of the book Head First, Servlets, and JSP. This book is considered by many people to be a very good book on Java-based web applications. The second edition of this book was released in 2008, so parts of it are getting a bit dated. However, the sections of the book that we will be covering are still quite relevant, and I'll let you know if I think there's some material that needs to be brought up to date with the current practice. Here's a very simplified way of looking at a web application. A website is a collection of mostly static web pages. It's written using HTML, hypertext markup language, and CSS, cascading style sheets. To use a website, all you need is a web browser and a connection to the internet. In contrast, a GUI application that is local to your machine runs natively on your system. It's fast and it's pretty, well, hopefully. But if you're a developer, you have to worry about getting users to download and install your application. And you have to somehow make sure that they're keeping your application up to date. GUI applications are written in Java or a similar general-purpose programming language. With a web application, you get what some would consider to be the best of both worlds. A dynamic application that can respond to user input, but can also be run in a web browser, which means it can be continuously modified and updated. In 2016, there were about 3.5 billion people using the internet. That's from Internet Live Stats. And by the way, over half of those people are in Asia. In 2015, there were about 2.5 billion smartphone subscriptions. That number is expected to double before 2020. And in 2013, the number of websites reached 1 billion. That's a lot of computers, smartphones, and servers. So the web is booming. Let's remind ourselves what a web client and a web server does. A web client allows a user to request a resource from the web server, and it also displays the result of that request. The client uses a web browser. The browser knows how to communicate with the web server, and the browser also knows how to interpret HTML code, and it renders the web page received by the server. The web server receives requests for a resource from a client, locates the resource, and returns it to the server. The resource may be a web page, an image, a movie, a PDF file, or some other type of data. Before we get too far into this, let's make sure we're clear on the distinction between HTML and HTTP. HTML is the language used to tell the browser how to display a page, whereas HTTP is the protocol that clients use to send requests to servers, and servers use to send responses back to clients. Here's an example of some HTML code. The page starts with an HTML begin tag and ends with an HTML end tag. Line 2 is a simple comment. You can broadly divide most web pages into two parts, the header and the body. The header usually contains information that applies to the page as a whole. However, in this case, the header only contains the title of the page, and you can see here that the title is rendered on the browser's tab. The body contains the page's contents. The first element in the body is the heading on line 7, which is rendered by the browser as text that is much larger than normal text. After the header is a reference to an image. Now, you will notice that the code for this image is not embedded in the page. It's just referenced using the name star.jpg. In order to render the image, the client has to send an additional request to the server in order to receive the JPEG code that makes up the image. Once it gets that JPEG content, the browser can render the image. By the way, that's why sometimes the page loads quickly, but the images take more time, because they're part of additional requests of the server whose content has to be transferred separately back to the client. The next thing you see in the body is a form. And forms are interesting because they allow you to send additional information above and beyond the address and a port number with your request. The fields in this form, name and password, are rendered by the browser as text boxes to be filled in. Finally, a submit button will send a request to the server that contains both name and password information.